Hey, it's Caleb Stevens from the Community Bank podcast here at SouthState Bank's Correspondent Division, and I'm excited to share with you a special conversation that we recorded here on the podcast with one of our board members here at SouthState, Ben Sasse. Many of you may know Ben Sasse. He was a United States Senator from Nebraska. He also served as the president of the University of Florida and was recently diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And so we are so grateful that Ben took the time to share his wisdom with our listeners here on the show. This is a podcast for community bankers. Everything we do on this show is all about creating value for community banks all over the country. And so we normally put this show out just on Apple and Spotify. But we wanted to put this one on YouTube because of the special opportunity to have Ben on and because he's been sharing his message on a number of platforms over the past couple of months. And so we wanted to put this out on YouTube for not just our banking community and the bankers that listen, but for the broader community as well. So if this is your first time joining us, this is the podcast by bankers for bankers. If you're a banker, we'd love for you to subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Again, just click the link in the show notes here of this episode to follow us. But if you're not a banker, I hope you'll still enjoy this conversation with our board member, Ben Sasse. This was recorded a couple of weeks ago between Ben, myself, and Chris Kamienski with our Florida banking group here at the bank. So thanks for joining us. Let's jump in.
Well, Ben, thanks for joining us. Great to see your face, and really appreciate
delighted.
you joining us.
My face has a little bit of skin this week, which is new over the last month. So I'm delighted to be not just audio, but with you visually. Nice. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've set up the conversation with a little bit about your background, and I thought before we dive in to kind of the topics we want to cover, I just want to give you an update, or give you the opportunity to give us an update just on how are you doing? How's your health? Any update you give to those listeners out there?
Thank you. I'll go maybe bad, good. So pancreatic cancer is pretty nasty. It's got a 3% survival rate, and that's the rare cases where people get diagnosed early. I was symptomatic starting in October, diagnosed in mid-December, and presented at worse than average stage 4. So that's not good math. Was given 3 to 4 months to live 122 days ago. So the next good is we're sort of beating that clock. And the third good is I'm on a really, really interesting clinical trial drug called daraxonrasib from this Silicon Valley really interesting company called Revolution Medicines. And we're finding a genetic mutation to bind a protein to, so you can deliver a lot more poison to the tumor than you normally can via traditional chemo, because traditional chemo hits, the tissue of the subject as well as the bad guy tumors. And so right now we're getting poison avoiding Ben and hitting a lot of tumor. And so I'm about 76% reduced tumor volume over 3.5 months, and therefore a lot less pain. So I feel blessed no matter what happens. But right now, 3 or 4 months of cancer treatment have been way easier than they should have been. So I'm grateful.
Well, your outlook over the past few months has touched many people's lives. I've heard from so many people, and your words and your interviews just being kind of handed around have really touched the hearts of a lot of people I know. So really just appreciative for the way that you've led even through difficult circumstances. So glad to hear the update is that there's good, bad. There's a little bit of mix in there. So happy to hear that.
Thank you, Chris.
I wanted to kind of take us back a little bit. You mentioned kind of October, and when you and I first met, I'm going to give you a layup here because I'm going to mention de Tocqueville, which I know you love.
Oh, thank you.
You addressed de Tocqueville and talked about kind of this concept of art of association and how he viewed kind of American life and the communities and the way they were built. And I remember thinking, man, this what he's talking about is kind of the fabric of the community banking system in America, which is very different than other parts around the world. So, obviously, we've had the pleasure of you joining the SouthState Bank board. What attracted you to banking and joining a bank board, and maybe talk a little bit about why banking has such an important place in your life, and that you wanted to devote some professional time to it.
Oh, thank you. I'll take on both of those foci. Maybe I'll do a little bit on the banking point first, and my honor at getting to serve on the South State Bank board. But then we head to Tocqueville as well. Um, I came out of college in 1994. You know, the digital revolution wasn't understood in the same way then as it is now, but we had all these weird terms bouncing around. The World Wide Web and e-commerce were the two big ones. The internet had been I was in college 90 to 94, and the internet became a thing that was regular citizen facing a little bit in 92, 93, but it basically meant there was a computer lab somewhere on college campuses where nerds could go and learn how to send email to somebody on another college campus. But there wasn't really a commercial internet till about 95. And it was clear to me when I thought about the investment banking versus strategy management consulting tracks, et cetera, that a guy who wanted to go home to Nebraska. So I went to school in Boston, not because I was a great brain, but because I was a crappy enough athlete that, you know, Harvard had bad sports and they'd let me play where Nebraska never was going to. And I wanted to figure out how to get back home, and strategy consulting felt like a yuppie sweatshop nerd way to learn a lot in a lot of different sectors. Max Weber has the distinction between entrepreneurial and bureaucratic management. Entrepreneurial management is shifting resources and changing what the structure of an organization does. Bureaucratic, which is a word we use negatively a lot, really means like sustain and maintain the stuff that needs to keep going. And I knew that at a time of disruption, there was an opportunity to learn fast if you could be connected to executive teams that were going to have to figure out how to be entrepreneurial, even inside extant organizations. But even though I wasn't going to go into iBanking, I've always been kind of a finance nerd and wanted to learn about it. But over the last handful of years, as I've had opportunities, I've been blessed to be able to pick and choose among some boards. I really wanted to go on a bank board that was heavily engaged in local communities because I think that's where the future is built. I think 330 million person nation that is the US is the best experiment in the history of governance, but 330 million people can't be your friends. And so you learn love through little platoons and you transfer from 20 people and 50 people and 7 people, love and affection and co-laboring to something like a nation. You don't start at the nation and work back to the local. You start at the local and you learn how to be a friend and to be honorable and to do things that build. And then you transfer those learnings and identities to things bigger. And that really is kind of what Tocqueville was talking about. You did give me a big fastball here. We didn't pre-plan this. That you just know that I fall asleep a lot because of my morphine doses. So you thought you had to get me on a track that I've talked about before. But the way I explain it to like seventh graders is, and when you're a U.S. senator and you're going to travel 93 counties of rural Nebraska, you end up in front of, you know, fourth grade, seventh grade, 11th grade classrooms. Tocqueville's really hard to understand if you just look at Democracy in America as a 1,500-page book that'll scare everybody away, until you realize he didn't really write it as a 1,500-page book. He wrote a lot of 4 and 7-page journalistic articles and letters back to France trying to explain what America was in the 1830s and 40s. And, you know, everybody from the UK and Europe looking at the American Revolution, 1776, failed Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the return of George Washington as president, elected in 1788, you know, inaugurated in 1789. They expected that America was going to be kind of interesting nerds debating political philosophy and maybe theology and religion, especially in the North. Virginia was a little more exclusively commercial, but in Massachusetts, you had a lot of theological fighting going on. What they didn't expect is the railroads, the steamship revolution, the rise of all sorts of what was called then the putting out revolution, sort of like a proto factory model before you had an assembly line in the center. Like products would move around a bunch of different workshops in a given community. They didn't expect that. And so 40 or 50 years later, you're in the 1830s and 40s, and America is booming economically, and nobody in Europe knows why. And so Tocqueville decides to take it upon himself to do this journalistic project of traveling America and explaining it back to France, what's going on there. He was doing it partly as a service, but partly because he was a young guy who wanted to travel and see the world. And so he wanted to make sense of why all these religious zealots and political philosophy nerds on the edge of the earth would now be entrepreneurs. And so he goes to Washington, D.C. The assumption is if you have a dynamic economy, it must be built from the political centers of power. And he gets to D.C. and nothing's going on. Like it's a swamp that nobody's around in the summer and there's no economic activity. It makes no sense to him. And so at that point, there were 25 states. He traveled to, I think, 18 of the 25. He again now goes, instead of the federal capital, he goes to all the state capitals, and he realizes as he gets to the 10th or the 12th or the 15th one, wow, the center of America is out here in the hinterlands, but it's still not in the government buildings. It's at something between the Rotary Club and your local bank branch. It is where people persuade other people to, by volunteerism, join their projects. It's not a continuum between centralized power on the one hand or the Unabomber, some isolated individual alone in a shed in Montana. It is the vitality of 5:30 on a Tuesday when you try to persuade somebody to come to your church this weekend, or to join the YMCA board, or to be a part of a syndicate banking relationship and loan some money to somebody as they start an angel investor fund in their neighborhood. And so I think that South State is the Tocquevillian tradition in 2026.
Well, glad I could serve up the fastball for you, Ben. I knew.
Sorry to give a monologue.
I knew you'd wax professorial there. You bring up a really interesting point, because you've obviously spent time in Nebraska in the 7th and 11th grade classrooms in the community. You've also spent time on the Senate Banking Committee and the Finance Committee. How do you bring that approach and your time there on those committees? How did you approach the fact that the real work does get done in the small communities, but at the same time, to your point, the construct of government has such a big impact? How was that time spent? What did you learn, and how did that impact you?
I mean, maybe let's distinguish between committees in general and then the banking committee and the work I did there, but with a caveat of, don't mean to be capital P partisan in any of what I say about the policy making there. Sure. But I think what I'll say about policy coming out of the banking committee is hopefully common sense. I'm pretty sure my friend Mark Warner, Democrat from Virginia, would agree with the majority of what I'll say. But the Congress doesn't work, which is a shame. The Senate should be the world's greatest deliberative body. We're obviously going through a period of radical disruption. We've already talked a little bit about the digital revolution, but my shorthand way of thinking about this is 50 or 100 years. I was in the Senate for 8.5 years, and then I've been a university president twice. But really, my work history is in strategy consulting, but my training is as an academic historian. And so one of a historian's job is to say, if the numerator is change and the denominator is time, what are we going to say the variables were that led to change over time, and how much change over time was there? I think 50 or 100 years from now, we look back on this moment. We're not going to talk about politics or policy hardly at all. We're going to talk about a technological revolution where almost everybody before us has worked with atoms, and almost all workers after us are going to work with bits. So the rise of the knowledge economy means the vast majority of people have ethereal or hybrid or digital only work experiences in the knowledge economy. And we've never had a civilization of lifelong learners, and we have to build that right now. So what's weird is the opportunity is gigantic. Like at a consumption level, the median American is already the richest person any time and place in history. And that hockey stick curve, I guess this way, is only going to go up. But it's not all good news, because it unsettles the nature of people's productivity. And if you're 22, every 22-year-old in the past has been able to assume they're going to work maybe in the same firm, but definitely in the same industry until death or retirement. And that's never going to be true again, which is super unsettling, because more consumption doesn't really make people happier. More meaningful production and output and doing something to love your neighbor is what makes people happier. And so unsettled work is really scary. The Congress doesn't work largely because the biggest things that are happening are just way upstream from politics. Technological revolution, creating economic revolutions, which are undermining a sense of place, community, thickness. And politics is like an echo screaming about that. So Congress doesn't work. But in the committee structure, Intel, which is where I spent most of my time, does work. largely because it's national security, which is a unique domain of the federal government. So there isn't really another sector to compete with, though the rise of big tech there is interesting as well. Banking had a lot of good people on it, but was an echo of the tribal screaming that was happening everywhere else in Washington. So we just didn't get very much done. But it was pretty clear what my job was to do every day in banking, which was to help the, again, trying to be gentle about the partisan continuum here, but the more statist members of the committee, or the bureaucracy that just assumes anytime there's a problem, if you decree a rule and you prohibit something, you'll solve that problem. That's almost never the right way to think about the world. There are going to be second and third order effects. And if you wanted to end motor vehicle deaths, you could just set the national speed limit at 3 miles an hour. You'll have ended any utility around vehicles, but you could stop people getting killed by cars. But the downside cost is too high. And we have a lot of people who have a regulatory first mindset. Mike Rowe is a friend of mine, and he always makes fun of the phrase safety first. He's like, no, safety third. Sometimes safety second, sometimes safety 11th, but never safety first. If safety first was the only thing you're trying to do, just don't do the work. And I think we have a lot of bureaucrats who think rules first, regulation first. What we really need is some nuance so there's accountability for institutions that lend recklessly. But my main job on the banking committee was to fight against dumb regulation.
Well, Ben, you're taking me back to AP US history, 11th grade
Both
here
of you have
with the
insulted me. AP US history teacher and nerd professor. If my 14-year-old boy might be gentle with me, but my 20-something daughters would go, "Oh, Dad, you're obviously talking too long." They're
no,
both
shout
calling you
out.
professor.
Yeah, shout out to Miss Smiley. She was fantastic, great teacher.
Well played.
So you mentioned the digital revolution. I'll never forget during COVID, I was just got married, had no kids. My wife worked the night shift at a hospital. She would stack her days like 6 nights in a row. So for 6 nights, I had nothing going on. And I remember one week just sitting on the couch reading your book, Them, Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal. And I devoured that book. And I was like, man, this is one of the better books that I've ever read. And it's, to your point, it's really not a political book. You're talking about effects that are far upstream, from politics. And two things that stuck out to me in that book. One is the loneliness epidemic, which maybe we can get to that in a minute, and the Chicago heat wave, that's crazy story. But the digital revolution and how that's really upended work. This is a show for community bank executives, and the average age of a community bank CEO today is 61.
Yeah.
But we also have a lot of younger leaders who are listening. And so I guess any advice to the older leaders who are just sort of caught off guard by how fast things have gone? And then any advice to younger leaders? I feel like they've been told for a long time, learn coding, and now you can vibe code stuff up willy-nilly. Any advice to those two sets of leaders?
Wow, really important and meaty work. Thanks for the kind words about them. Radically under-edited, but some decent ideas in there at its core. But one of the backdrop points to that book is that we just don't have enough intergenerationalism. So to your 61-year-olds, thank you for the work you do to mentor the 25, 30, and 35-year-olds and nudge and encouragement to doing more of it. The digital native world, I guess let's back up. When I give a speech on almost any topic right now, question 1, 2, or 3 afterwards, regardless of what the topic was, is some version of, is AI going to bring heaven or is AI going to bring hell? And I immediately attack the or in that statement because the right answer is yes. AI is going to bring heaven and it's going to bring hell. What AI is an acceleration of almost all human activity by the commodification of intelligence and IQ, such that anything that can be reducible to a series of steps is going to become dang near ubiquitous and free really fast. We may not get to the place where marginal compute cost is genuinely zero, but it's going to be so close to zero that we're probably not going to meter it in most contexts, which means economics, which has always been a discipline about scarcity, in so many ways is going to become a discipline or a riddle about abundance. What do you do with ubiquitous free stuff and services? And it's not good. Like, I mean, there's a lot about it that's good, but on net, humans don't do well without constraints. You do not want a ton of inherited wealth before you have any habits. It's bad for your soul. And so we should recognize that there's good and ill coming in the digital revolution. But I'm 54, and in your 61-year-old hypothetical, we know a world that was pre-ubiquitous digital technologies. A lot of the 25 to 35-year-old budding executives inside a community bank or the businesses that you're lending to in a community, they don't actually know a world where you didn't have digital tools that sucked our consciousness away from the time and place where you hug people and where you break bread together. And that is a real cost to not know the thickness of real community first and then layer in the digital revolution as a benefit on top. But if the digital revolution can be thought of as a substitute to bodily engagement, it's really bad for you. And so I don't know the right answer, but I do know we need more 30-year-olds and 60-year-olds sitting together and wrestling through the questions of what it looks like to get the benefits of these tools without all of the costs. And that requires a lot more digital Sabbaths and thick communities. I won't do it now, but I can think about some groups that I'm a part of where, excuse my hiccups, we have some solid ground rules that phones are just not allowed in these places. And for these hours, the phone is gone and everybody has to actually be present. And that includes the synchronous moments that are awkward. But it turns out like real dating with a human is way better than texting with someone who's posing and grooming a fake identity. And so real human engagement often has awkwardness, and the 30 and 60-year-olds are going to experience that if they're doing the right work together, and kudos to those who are.
Well, Ben,
Yeah, well,
you know,
go
you
ahead,
may have
Chris.
given us a hard time about calling you a professor, and your kids may tease you, but my kids are going to accuse me of planting that question or paying you to say that they should be off their screens more. So I heard digital Sabbath and put the phones away. So that I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Amen.
Well, that's a good segue into part two of my question, which was the loneliness epidemic. And I know you've written in the past about the tragedy of age segregation. We don't grow up around grandma and grandpa, like we used to. Community banks really are, in many ways, the pillar of a local community, the bank, the school. Any thoughts on how our community bank listeners could be creators and curators of community more intentionally?
I know something about the charge we need to give. I don't think I know the mechanism by which we get there, but I'll go history nerd prof one more time. From 1870 to 1920, it wasn't clear. Let's say from 1870 to 1890, it wasn't clear that America was going to survive. From 1900 to 1920, it was pretty clear that it was going to work, and now we understood why. What had happened is we went from an agrarian first set of communities to mostly urban communities. And people didn't know that you would be able to have the thickness of, let's call it textured Tocquevillianism, in those new places. And we rebuilt the thickness of the not for profit sector plus, but like Grass Tops community engagement, the Rotary Club. We rebuilt that in urban ethnic neighborhoods that mirrored some of what used to be true on the New England village town green. We need to do that again, but it's going to be harder this time because the temptations to again let our consciousness and our identity and our friends or fake friends, faux digital friends, drift away from the place where you actually break bread in common with people, which is why I think the two parts of your question, Caleb, fit so neatly together. The loneliness epidemic is incredibly weird and scary that Americans are this much richer than we've ever been before, and yet our community texture has become this much shallower this fast. A parallel issue is the natalism crisis, right? We, around the world, all industrialized nations, all rich nations, with two exceptions, have just stopped having babies, right? Historic replacement birth rate is 2.1 births per woman. Um, Everywhere in the industrialized world, the number bounces somewhere around 1.5. There are some places like Seoul, South Korea, it's like 7/10 of a baby per person, per mom, instead of 2.1. And the world just doesn't work in a world where you don't have a future and people are making those investments. And people have more resources than they've ever had before. It's just kids have always been an inconvenience. In the past, you just dealt with that because it's a bet on the future. And now, weirdly, we're so drugged into comfort, short-term comfort, that people don't want to do anything that might be a discomfort on a Saturday morning. And so it is very weird to think about a world where people stop having babies, but it's analogous to a world where people stop building thick community. And we're going to need to rebuild the institutions or the third spaces where people convene. And I do think right around community banking, you have all the right people in the room. I served in the Senate for 8.5 years, and Nebraska is a small enough place, right at 2 million people. It's a little bit like when someone's a member of the House of Representatives and they have 700,000 constituents. There are probably 300 to 500 of their constituents who have the congressman or the congresswoman's cell phone number. And when you think about who are those 300 to 500 people who know your cell phone number, they tend to be the head of the United Way in a given community. They're the head of the local college. They're the CEO of the hospital, etc. They're all the people that are basically the community banking grass tops network. And those are the folks who are going to have to rebuild the new kind of hybrid Tocquevillian Rotary clubs of the next generation to get past the weirdness of the loneliness crisis, where you have a collapse in the number of relationships people have. And just to touch very briefly on one other element of this is the gendered piece. Women seem to be doing, since the rise of the iPhone in 2007 and faster download speeds 2009 to 11, women's health, mental health, sociability has declined radically as well, but men's has declined more over the last 20 to 30 years, where there are a lot of 25 to 65-year-old women in your communities that still have a number of actual relationships, and a lot of dudes just don't have any relationships anymore. If you poll, Robert Putnam and others have done this, if you poll 60-year-olds, about 65% or pushing 2/3 of 60-year-old men define their wife as their best friend. About a quarter of 60-year-old women define their husband as their best friend. Mm-hmm. And what's going on there, you can make all sorts of jokes, but what's really going on there is 60-year-old women actually just know lots of people in their community, and 60-year-old men, on average, statistically don't know anybody but their wife right now. That's weird, and we're going to figure out how to rebuild community, and a lot of that is shared projects.
Yeah.
That need to be loaned.
And is it Israel that's the only developed country that's above replacement?
You got it. So the two, they're actually demographically, sociologists will define it as there are four groups that are outliers. Mormons everywhere, Orthodox Jews in the U.S., and Orthodox and secular Jews in Israel. So stated differently, Orthodox Jews, a lot of places, there are 15 million Jews on earth, and about 7 million are in the U.S., about 7 million are Israel, about 1.5 million everywhere else. So Orthodox Jews everywhere, Mormons everywhere, and the only secular community that still has an above replacement rate, birth rate, is secular Israeli Jews.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue because, Chris, you had a question about the Iran conflict.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're talking about, to community bank executive teams and leaders, and obviously uncertainty is something that no one likes. And two of the greatest uncertainties I feel like around those executive tables are, one, we talked about a little bit, the digital revolution and kind of where AI is headed. And then the second, more recently and more immediate, is the conflict in the Middle East and the conflict with Iran. Where does this go? How long does it last? And the effect that it has on energy prices and inflation. And just curious, Ben, your perspective. You mentioned the Intel Committee, and just wanted to get your real time thoughts on where does this conflict go from here. How does it wrap up, and maybe what's the impact if you're sitting at a community bank board trying to figure out the downstream effects on the American economy? What advice or wisdom or thoughts do you have for everybody listening?
I don't know that if what I have to say rises to the level of either wisdom or advice, but I'll give you some popcorn to put around the whiteboard. First of all, I've been very active in the intelligence community for a couple of decades, and so I still get briefings on a fairly regular basis. My hospital, MD Anderson in Houston, bunch of rock stars. But my skiff of choice, where I get my briefings, is in Washington D.C., and I'm traveling a little less than usual right now. So I want to be clear. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't cross the line to say classified stuff, but I'm not as current as I would usually be. But I think the broadest way to think about this backdrop is that the regime in Tehran, um, you know, death to Israel, death to the U.S., is a deeply committed ideological belief system. And I think sometimes our political and economic leadership in the West doesn't understand what it means to deal with people who are really committed to a cause that is not reducible to a set of pragmatic variables. And so I am strongly on the side of, and again, this is without current intel about the state of the nuclear program either before or after the last couple of weeks, but I am strongly on the side of it is important to be ahead of the curve on a lot of the threats that we face, because the will to use a nuclear weapon against free peoples is there, and so the weapon cannot be built and attained. So I'm on the side of there is preventative stuff that is sometimes necessary. At the same time, um, you need to think through the questions of, if you do delayering, who would you ultimately hope could lead a regime in a time of collapse and replacement? I'm from rural Nebraska, and I believe in grass tops leadership. I live out in the country, but there's a 25,000 person town 6 miles away from where we are on the river. And in that 25,000 person town, if I went into the Walmart today, there's nobody I'm just going to run into that I assume could lead Iran today, right? In the same way, if you go 4 or 5 or 6 layers deep in Iranian society, there's not somebody in a random retail store that you're just going to think could hold together a potentially fractious community. And so, one of the things that, again, just the generic headline version, that the US and Israel have jointly done is go a layer deeper, go a layer deeper, go a layer deeper, taking out a lot of bad guys. I understand that impulse and I sympathize with it, but there does have to be a next order question of who would lead in a time of breakup. And it isn't the case that Iran, it's not the same as Iraq in terms of the ethnic division inside Iraq, but it's also not the case that Iran is a monolith. It is not overwhelmingly unified, complete, wholly Persian. There are lots of different subcommunities in there, and a civil war situation would be horrible for its own people, but also for the global economy and around the Straits of Hormuz. And one of the things that Iran has been doing for decades is funding a lot of different militias across an ideological spectrum. And there's a reason why almost every country from Iran all the way over to the Med has so much chaos and insufficient centralized government. I say this as a small government guy, but when you look at Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, etc., so many countries have been destabilized by the way they have funded groups. And so we would like to see their command and control powers from Iran reduced, because it's the right thing for people who should aspire to be free and self-governing, but it's also necessary for global energy flows. I'll stop there, but I'll just say I suspect, because of Russian energy and because of North American energy, there are reasons why this particular scary moment is a little less scary than it might have been 15 or 20 years ago, because there are other sources of supply besides the Mideast. I don't want a moment where global prices are so high that it both constrains American business, but also that it enriches Russia. So there's a lot that's broken here, but I think uncertainty is the keynote to lead with.
Yeah. Well, Ben, we don't want to keep you past your time. I guess quickly, last question from me would just be, we've got a lot of leaders listening to this show. They will all face criticism at some point during their leadership journey. You've faced criticism both from the opposing political party, your own political party. How do great leaders process criticism, whether it's fair or unfair?
No, that's a fun question. I have not reflected on that for quite a while. Maybe as backdrop, I'll say it's weird to be when I left office, I guess January of 23. I was at that point the highest vote getter in the history of Nebraska, even though I had never run for anything until ran for Senate in 2013, 14. But I was also by far the most sanctioned person in the history of Nebraska politics, which is just another weird way of saying if you have a bell curve distribution, loud voices at this moment in our media ecology, at both, two standard deviations of the bell curve, are going to get a lot more attention than they're really representative of, which is a way of saying lots and lots of censure and sanction of Ben Sasse, and yet was really popular with a broad cross, getting 70% of the vote and winning 92 of 93 counties in my last election. The I think it's important to have some barometer on, just because people are loud, does that mean they're representative? There are a lot of people who are really angry. That's not a reason to not be scrutinizing and circumspect, but it means, how do you find a way to have feedback loops where you can get criticism from people who are wise, who are representative, and who are trying to ultimately be constructive. I don't think it's that useful. I had the FBI come to my house at one point in 2017 and again in 2018 and say, "Dude, you are weird. You get a lot of death threats." And I said, "Yeah, but don't a lot of politicians?" And they say, "Yes, but if they get it, it's concentrated from one side of the political spectrum. You and Paul Ryan are the only two guys we know that constantly get death threats from both the left and the right. Why are you so weird?" And I don't think you should take those kinds of things very seriously, but I think you should build mechanisms early so that there's room for a lot of 360 feedback from people who are wise and have your growth and your stewardship of and service to a community as the heart of their motive for why they want to tell you, "Hey, here's 2 positive things and here's 5 things I want to hit you upside the head about."
That's great. Well, Ben, thank you so much for spending time on the podcast today. I know there's a lot of ways you could be spending your time, and thank you for spending it with us. And I would just encourage our listeners, go listen to Ben's podcast. It's called Not Dead Yet. You've done some phenomenal interviews with some really awesome guests, and you've really run the gamut as far as topics and different personalities on there. And so we thank you for your service to South State. Thank you for your service on our board, and
Thanks,
thank
Kelly.
you what you've done for this country. And to my chagrin, to the University of Florida as a Georgia Bulldog guy, you and Tim Tebow are my favorite Gators. So I appreciate what you do there too.
Well, you named one that was a lot more interesting than me. If I weren't on morphine, I'd try to do a bulldog bark for you.
Ben, thanks so much for the time today. Great to be with you.
Thanks, Chris. I enjoyed it. Thank you for the invite. Appreciate you guys.